Okay, hi everyone. This is the last topic in RESM 540, geospatial modeling. It's on geographically weighted regression. Now, last time we worked with some Sheehan, who was a graduate student in the fisheries program, and he had a bunch of data in which he was estimating substrate, and he had a paper that was published based upon his work. And I'm just going to refer some things from his work in this paper. So these are those two sites, the Grayling and the Wikipedia site. And he has a lot of stats here comparing the OLS tests that were done throughout. So I refer to this paper for you as a really nice template to use when using these OLS or even the GWR type of modeling approaches. And he has the standardized residuals map, which shows areas of over or under prediction. And also for the other creek, as you see here. And then the local R squared, so you can see specifically throughout his maps where the model did better and where it did worse than other places. All right, so in reviewing those two areas, the 6 checks, going through each of these, the coefficients have to have the expected signs, redundancy, no redundancy in explanatory variables, coefficients statistically significant, residuals are normally distributed. Not really good, strong adjusted R-squared values here. I guess a 0.6 is considered relatively strong, but 0.51 really isn't. And they both failed in terms of the residuals were not spatially are not spatially autocorrelated. So the dependent variable again was substrate, and the independent variables, essentially depth, is what the best model fit was for this. In the OLS, you see very different in terms of especially the adjusted R squared. So we have some really low values, obviously, with this particular test checks. And this was with the dependent variable being substrate, and this time the independent variable was flow, based upon the model run for that one. And then the last one, again, dependent variable substrate, depth, and flow, came out pretty good in terms of what PD passing most of the tests here, except the residuals are not spatially autocorrelated. So 0.68 was the adjusted R square for this one. All right, well, the main thing is that there was a lot of red in the bottom of this table, this one, and also this one. So we have a misspecified model because of the spatial effects. They all had spatially autocorrelated residuals. So what do? Well, it just makes it very difficult when we model spatial data to meet the assumptions and requirements of traditional non-spatial statistic methods like OLS. And it's just the fact that our geographical features are more often than not spatially autocorrelated. So each feature, it means that features near each other tend to be more similar than features further apart. That creates an over-counting type of bias for traditional non-spatial regression methods. So geography is important, and often the processes most important to what you're modeling are non-stationary. So true spatial regression methods were developed to robustly manage these two characteristics of spatial data, and even to incorporate the special qualities of spatial data to improve their ability to model data relationships. Some spatial regression methods deal effectively with the first characteristic of spatial autocorrelation, while others, they deal effectively with the second one, non-stationarity. And at present, no spatial regression methods are effective for both characteristics. For a properly specified globally weighted regression model, however, spatial autocorrelation is typically not a problem. So that's why we're talking about it today. We're moving toward geographically weighted regression. In ordinary least squares, however, we deal with local trends. We can get rid of the spatial autocorrelation by resampling it. We're doing a spatial filtering. In terms of resampling, that would be a selection of a subset of data points to run the OLS regression. So essentially, you choose a random process to select those sample locations, and whenever you get a random selection of those samples in which you don't have spatial autocorrelation using the Moran's eye, that'd be a good one. So it's a resampling process to get to around that particular misspecification. Spatial filtering is another option. This idea is to filter out the spatial part of the variable. So you essentially try to remove the spatial part of the variable and then rerun the model, and hopefully you get better. The process for this spatial filtering is you can go back and run that incremental spatial autocorrelation tool to identify that distance in which that spatial autocorrelation is strongest, the maximum peak, not the first peak, but the maximum peak. Once you find that distance, you can then filter each observation into spatial and non-spatial components. So you essentially are creating two different kind of dependent variable data sets in which to create your model. Or what you can do is you can use geographically weighted regression. So again, just to summarize, if we have spatial effects in our model, we can do spatial filtering, we can resample, okay, or that's just ways to deal with these local trends, or we can use GWR. Now, globally weighted regression, geographically weighted regression is a local regression model. And what I mean by that is the coefficients are allowed to vary. So instead of our ordinary least squares, which was global, we have local regression model with geographically weighted regression. OLS gave us one equation, and now we have one equation for each feature. So for each row in our table, for each mapped feature, point, line, or polygon. And it's calibrated using data from nearby features. In OLS, those relationships are fixed. In GWR, those relationships can vary across the study area. Every feature has a different coefficient for each variable in geographically weighted regression. So you can think about it this way. So for GWR, each feature gets a separate equation. And that kind of looks like this. You see our regression equation there. Those exist for every single one of those polygons that you see. So we start with OLS and the results, if they are properly specified, to improve them in geographically weighted regression. There's a lot less diagnostics in GWR. So that's why we kind of want to start with OLS if we can, and then determine if we have the spatial effect, then we can use GWR. You usually don't jump right into GWR if you don't have to. So in terms of running GWR, again, it's a local spatial regression model as compared to a global one like OLS was. And GWR variables are the same as OLS, except do not include the spatial regime dummy variables, and they also do not include variables with little value variation. Defining local. The GWR requires a definition of what you're calling nearby, using the kernel type or the bandwidth method. The kernel type is used to find what is nearby, and the default for bandwidth is fine, so we just kind of accept the distance that it does use. All right, what's really awesome in terms of GWR is that every single one of those records, rows in our column of our table, which represents a feature, has a local R-squared calculated for it, coefficient values, residuals, condition numbers, and predictions. So this allows you to see where the impact of the coefficients is occurring. All right, so now let's jump into the data set we're going to use for today's lab exercise 10. This is data that was created from a student who worked with the National Resource Conservation Service. She had a graduate research assistantship, and she was looking at where the NRCS was spending its time providing practices, which are essentially programs of outreach to different areas in the state. And she wanted to predict, if it was possible to predict, with different variables at the census tract levels, where areas were maybe overserved or underserved in terms of NRCS efforts, with the ultimate goal of NRCS being more efficient in their kind of outreach activities. So using geographically weighted regression, what we're doing is we're inputting in the NRCS practices shapefile, which has it's a shapefile of all the census tracts. our dependent variables of practices, that's their activity. And then we have all these explanatory variables we're trying to use to predict the output. I'm choosing a bunch of the defaults down here based upon the search radiuses and so on. So when this runs, what you get is you have to go down to the View Details. If you click on View Details right here, it's going to pop up with this particular screen. So there's a lot less diagnostics than ordinary least squares. That is usually why we do OLS first. So what we're doing is we're using GWR with this to determine if we can improve from previous runs with OLS, incorporating some of these spatial effects. So the output is a standardized residual mapping of those areas that you kind of over-predicted or under-predicted throughout the area. Now, what we can also do is with this standardized residual output, we can map that with, you can use that as an input into our Moran's eye to look for global spatial autocorrelation. Over and under predictions for a specified regression model will be randomly distributed. Clustering of over and or under predictions is generally evidence that you are missing at least some or one of the key explanatory variables. So you usually have to go in and examine the patterns in your OLS and GWR model residuals to see if they provide clues about what those missing variables might be. Run spatial autocorrelation, Moran's eye tool on the regression residuals to ensure that they are spatially random. And then statistically significant clustering of high or low residuals, model under and over predictions, indicates the GWR model is potentially misspecified. All right, like I mentioned, this is the attribute table, which is the output from a GWR run. And note the attributes that get added to this table. We have standardized residuals. We can use the Moran's eye tool. We have local R squared, so we can get an idea of how local effects did better or worse. We essentially have a model for each census tract. Each one of these rows has its own coefficients, own residuals, standardized residuals, and then also localized R squared. As we can see in our particular output, this is good. We're looking at our standardized residual field, and they are random. This is what we want. So we're noticing that we don't have spatial autocorrelation occurring in our residuals. So this is a pass of that particular test, essentially because the GWR model is accounting for that spatial variation. This is the census tracts with the practices showing the localized R squared. So you can see by the darker areas, the model fits a lot better in these particular regions. What would be interesting to do would be to overlay the NRCS management regions over the top of this. This might be a function of these two areas doing much better than some of the other places. Looks like it kind of forms these pockets throughout the state. And then also, let me go back up here. So as you can see in your output table of contents, what you get are these charts, which can be very useful as well for you to check out. This gives you an idea between the relationships between variables, so you can see why one is going up or down, the relationship positively or negatively of the impact of the different variables across the spectrum of their use. This is a distribution of the standardized residual. We're looking for this to be normally distributed, which looks pretty good in this case. And then this is the standardized residual and predicted plot. So the standardized residual, this is a measure of the strength of the difference between observed and expected values. When you compare the cells, those standardized residuals makes it easy to see which cells are contributing the most to the value and which are contributing the least. The residual plot shows a fairly random pattern is what we have here, and that's what we want. The first residual is positive, then the next are at negative, the fourth is positive, and the last residual is negative, and so on. This random pattern indicates that a linear model provides a decent fit to our data, which is preferred in terms of our modeling process. So that's GWR, and that's just some insights in terms of using it for this census tract data and the practices by NRCS. Refer back to this when you're working in the exercise 10. It'll help you in terms of fitting that model and looking at the variables, their importance, the standardized residuals, and how the GWR modeling takes care of those spatial effects.